Hi everybody, I'm Kath Slessor and welcome to my Bloomsbury Kitchen lockdown. I was very pleased to be asked to participate in Bedtime Stories, so thank you to Alicia for inviting me. So like many people, I've been muddling through lockdown and found myself doing a great deal of cleaning, which as a Presbyterian Scot, I find both extremely satisfying and mildly therapeutic. And while engaged in my personal odyssey of Sillet Bang and kitchen roll, I've been listening to the radio and delving around in the BBC archives. And I discovered The Price of Fear, a series of 30-minute long modern horror fables narrated by the majestic Vincent Price, dating from the 1970s and early 80s. Price himself was a remarkable character who, as well as being an extremely versatile actor, he also studied art history and was fervently opposed to racism, supported gay rights long before it was fashionable, and was a noted gourmet cook and art connoisseur. And in an incredible and spooky coincidence, he shares the same birthday as my mother on the 27th of May. Big evil twin Gemini energy there. Cinematically, Price is best known for grand guignol epics such as The Abominable Dr. Phibes and Theatre of Blood, in which he plays a maligned and vengeful actor who bumps off a succession of pompous theatre critics in increasingly sadistic and ingenious ways. And of course, Masque of the Red Death, Roger Corman's histrionic adaptation of the Edgar Allan Poe classic tale about the inexorable spread of a deadly plague, which obviously resonates with these current horrific and horrifying times. Often unfairly despised, the horror genre can act as a cathartic means of exploring and confronting our most deep-seated fears. And of course, there is also a vicariously thrill in being knowingly scared witless within the framework of scenographic artifice. So long as we know the monsters aren't real, we can kid ourselves that all will be fine and there is nothing to fear. But now, lurking outside our cosy and spotlessly clean sanctuaries of lockdown, there are some very real monsters. A lethal pandemic, a callous and bumbling government response, and the nightmarish spectacle of thousands of people simply evaporating in terrible circumstances. Horrors that might have sprung from the imagination of Poe himself. So, in choosing my bedtime story, I wanted to find an exquisite and cathartic modern horror fable, so one that I could be imagined being narrated by Vincent Price on the radio while I scrubbed the fridge clean for the umpteenth time. The Masque of the Red Death would have been far too obvious, and most people are also familiar with the Antiquarians in Peril repertoire of M.R. James and the dubious weirdness of H.P. Lovecraft. I also wanted something with water in it, as I'm a swimmer and deeply miss my daily immersion. So I've chosen a short story by China Miéville called Säcken, a German word meaning, well, you'll see what it means. It formed part of a short story collection, 3 Moments of an Explosion, published in 2015. Miéville's work has been described as familiarly strange, full of elegant monstrosity. Bradbury meets Borges, with Lovecraft gibbering tumultuously just out of hearing. So you're in for a deeply creepy treat. So before I begin, I'm just going to sketch out a few helpful parameters. In Säcken, there are 2 English female protagonists, Joanna and Mel, who are also lovers. The story is mostly set in the German countryside, in Saxony, just southwest of Dresden, where Jo and Mel have rented an apparently idyllic cottage by a large, dark lake. Needless to say, there is something very nasty in the woodshed. So are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Säcken by China Miéville. Joanna took Mel to Dresden, to the Frauenkirche. They timed their visit to coincide with a monthly English evensong. "Firebombs not enough," Mel whispered. "Now we inflict Anglicanism on them." Her giggles attracted attention. They left the city and drove on busy roads for more than an hour through diminishing satellite towns. Then through smaller towns and a still damp, rolling landscape. "Into the woods," Joanna said, and made witch fingers. Past Tharent and through pretty forests, south at Freiburg. The country was thick with trees. Small rivers veered in the undergrowth. Joanna and Mel passed barn fronts, from which languid animals watched them. They ascended. "Is that the lake?" Joanna said. To the right, the trees climbed and grew more densely. To the left, as the slope fell away, they petered out. And through them, Joanna and Mel kept glimpsing water. They cheered. "There's a little village down there, I think," Joanna said. "Look out for a green gate. That's our marker." They saw it some distance off, slanting across a muddy turnoff. They drove down the rocking slant of gravel through trees, past what once might have been a neat garden, but was now boiling with greenery. Beyond the bramble and the house was the lake. There it was, imperfectly reflecting trees and sky, and the few other houses at its edge. The shore curved out of sight to the east. Mel and Joanna looked across the lake at moored boats, at paths and clearings in the trees where people could come down to the water. The house was modern and whitewashed. It looked to Mel like a film set. But they were both surprised at the roughness of the grounds. They pushed through the undergrowth like children finding secret paths. At the end of the jetty, a small boat swayed in the lake. "Come on," Mel said. She lowered herself in. She struggled with the oars. Ostentatiously cack-handed, laughing at their own incompetence, taking turns at the oars, Joanna and Mel wobbled away from the mooring, watched by birds. They hauled and pulled and mocked themselves. They slowed. They kissed, at last. If they were watched from many houses, they would be only specks. The air was cooling. After a few minutes, they turned their boat and headed back in. The first few hours after breakfast, Joanna worked on her essays. That had always been the plan. She piled up the books and printouts she had brought, theses on Dresden's golden age, centuries of diplomacy, law and culture. The books were thick with place markers. When Joanna came down to make coffee, she found Mel lying on the sofa. She had plugged her console into the television and was playing video games. Joanna had to look away. What incredible petulance, she thought, to do that here, amid all these trees, in that light, from this water. She felt the years between her and Mel. She felt like an older sister. But upstairs again, she sat back in her chair and glanced at the lake, and there, to her great pleasure and surprise, she saw Mel in the boat, gamely and inelegantly rowing. After supper, Mel headed back out. Grass pulled at her. She walked towards the dark chop of the lake. The shore was littered with dead, bleached plant matter. In England, she thought, the little waves would be throwing up crisp packets and plastic. Mostly the stones were the wrong shape to skim, but she found a diskish one and sent it skipping 5 times across the water. She felt again amongst the weeds. In the water at the shore, Mel saw what looked like a perfect stone, but when she picked it up, it was too light to be stone. She looked at it in the light from her phone. It was black wood, slick with algae, the size and shape of a medal. On one face were eroded ridges. She stared and felt them under her thumb. They weren't random. They were outlines, a tiny figure, 5 stick limbs. Mel stood quickly and swayed, suddenly dizzy. She shook her head at a sudden smell, and then the wind came in and brought a much worse gust. Jesus Christ, she said. Cold air buffeted the garden and her hair. She threw the wood as hard as she could into the undergrowth. While Joanna worked, Mel rode out most mornings with a big travel mug of coffee wedged between the knees of her least expensive jeans. The lake was green and silty. Mel reached into it. Her skin disappeared. Even in the sunlight, the dark water amputated her hand only a few centimetres down. She clutched unseen fingers, made a fist, saw nothing but eddies. A cockerel crowed. Mel started. She lost her grip on the cup where she'd rested it. It dropped into the water. "Ah, fuck," she said, and sat up, reaching for it quickly, but it was going down in bubbles and was almost instantly out of sight, leaving a coil of coffee. The crowing came again. It sounded close. Mel made the boat rock in the middle of all the water, looking around. But the only birds were far overhead and silent. After supper, Mel held the crowing again. She and Joanna were standing in the bedroom with the lights off, looking across the water and at the clouds. "Hear that?" Mel said. "That bird's nuts. It's the middle of the night." "I didn't hear." "There," said Mel. "There it is again." But Joanna was walking away. She pulled back the covers and lay down and waited. Mel did not sleep, but listened to the noises of the house. She listened to Joanna's breathing, its slow and lovely rhythm. Before dawn, Mel rose and tiptoed downstairs. She smoked the garden door open, exhaling into the tangle. When she finished her cigarette, she hesitated, then walked quickly through the vegetation. At the edge of the water, where the jetty touched the earth, Mel heard the rooster again. She waited. No lights appeared. She walked onto the planks over the water. At the end, the boat waited for her, so Mel climbed in. A fat fish somewhere flicked a tail. Mel looked over her shoulder. The boat was drifting into a patch of quivering water, dimpled as if with cellulite. Mel watched the stars' reflections. She put her hand in the cold lake. There was a swell. She flexed her fingers. The cockerel crowed. Mel jerked up and held her breath. The cockerel called again, much closer, more raucous, as if it had found something. And then, very fast and rushing, Mel felt a surge from below. In the water beneath her hand, something was rising. She cried out and snatched back her arm, and as she did, the bird screamed right by her. She shook and splashed, and the boat rocked on the black water. Mel gripped the wood and turned her head in panic, but could see nothing in the dark. The rooster didn't sound again. Mel huddled, shivering, while the boat calmed, while the sky lightened, as still as she could be. Her heart slowed. When adrenaline had ebbed from her enough that she no longer shook, she took hold of the oars with cold hands and rowed back to the lakeside house, where Joanna was just awake. "Did you dream last night?" Mel said. "Probably." Joanna was driving. Sun dappled the car. "Did you hear anything?" "You know me," Joanna said. She imitated stupefied snoring. "Why?" "Thought even you might have been defeated between me and the cock-a-doodle-doing," Mel said after a moment. "Kikiriki," said Joanna. Mel frowned at her. "German," said Joanna, "for cock-a-doodle-doo. Kikiriki." That night, the cockerel crowed again. Mel opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling. Joanna slept. They kept the curtains open to wake to daylight, so Mel saw the lake the moment she stood. She stood still for a long time. At last she walked naked to the window. She watched the shadows of the trees swaying, quick black clouds, the dark land and water, and the cockerel crowed again, and now it was the only sound, and it was urgent and closer. Mel touched the glass. She saw gathering wind in the motions of leaves, like a rainless storm. Something approaching. A rush of air that seemed to carry the cockerel's excited crow. The window pane vibrated. Wake up, Mel thought. Wake up, wake up. The wind slammed into the window, and Mel staggered, and there was the crowing again right there, and this time a hiss and a snarl too. Mel retched in a sudden sump stench. The air in the room was moist. As she straightened, holding the windowsill, she heard a liquid sound. She turned. Something was on the floor. A darkness, a gross misshape. Something huge and wrong and wet. It blocked her way. Mel's throat closed. The new thing in the room dripped. A nightmare calf, born without limbs or head or eyes, but full of tumours. A mound of leather in pooling mortar. It was a bag, a sack full of bad presents, of coal or earth or blood clots or ruined roots. Mel shook with her own heartbeat. The sack streamed. Mel's legs gave way beyond the nightmare thing Joanna dreamed, as if in another country. The black sack moved. It shoved from within with a sucking sound, a slurping. It lurched heavily towards her, splattering the floorboards. A fitful, dark groping, hauling her way. Its weight and spasming motion shook the room. It strained as if to split. The thing had voices, a cluck, a hiss, a predator's growl. It stopped closer still, and Mel heard a woman. Mel heard a woman vomit old water. She heard it spatter on the inside of the skin. The sack convulsed in mud that should not have been brought up. "Kikiriki," whispered the rooster inside the bag, with its throat full of lake. Mel crawled back to the wall and pushed with her legs as if they might drive her into it. The thing came with a scratch of claws, pushed through its own hide into the floor. It whispered. Its cold enveloped her. Cluck, cluck, the sack went, and hiss, and growl, and nein. And it came, and it was close, and it reached for her, so close she could see its wounds, criss-cross sutures tautening as the leather stretched, as if the sack would burst. She screamed. Joanna screamed, was there with Mel holding her and begging her to stop whispering to her, crouching in the glare of the lamp where there was no sack, no thing, where there was no wetness anymore. "What happened? What happened?" Joanna kept saying. "You're okay. You're okay." Something was here. Mel ran her fingers over the dry floor. Oh God, something missing. She put her hands to her mouth when that came out of it, because she didn't know what she meant. They drove through the dawn. Mel huddled in the passenger seat with her head in her hands. She kept looking up at Joanna in disbelief. Joanna watched the road. Her face was anguished and hard. "Mel, you're scaring me. You should be scared." None of them spoke for a long time. When they approached the airport, Joanna shouted, "This is insane. Tell me what happened." Mel tried. She swallowed. "There's something there," was all she could say. There were more seconds of silence. Then Mel got out of the car quickly and walked away. Joanna did not follow. She opened her own door but stayed behind the wheel. She watched Mel disappear into the terminal. talk?" Mel texted Joanna. "I'm back." London was under thick English clouds. Ever since she had sat down in the plane's flat fluorescent light, it had been hard for Mel even to think about what she had seen in the room. Her sense of it was scattered. Black plastic bags split like larvae from a rubble of dustbins. She crossed the city alone. "Please," she texted. "Feel sick. Sorry." Should I go back? Mel's thought shocked her. She remembered the dark thing in the room. She was drunk and uncertain, and the memory made her stomach spasm. She called again the next morning, hungover, determined to have a proper conversation. Joanna did not answer. Mel tried from a landline, which would not display her number on Joanna's phone, but got no response. She tried again the next day, and the call was answered by a soft-voiced German man. In courteous, slow English, he asked Mel who she was and how she knew the owner of this telephone. "Who the fuck are you?" she said. "I am police." The boat had been drifting, empty, aimless, across the lake. A neighbour had come to the house. The car was in the drive. There was food in the fridge. The door was unlocked. Joanna's computer, the officer said, was on the kitchen table. The boat had continued the silent random journey until the man took his own skiff out and snared it. One oar was missing. Another lay across the seats. A thumb's height of water slopped in the boat's bottom. In it was one of Joanna's slippers. Mel could not stop imagining Joanna, her arms up, fingers splayed, a pianist paused between movements, head nodding with the currents that must hold her 8 meters below the surface of the lake. Maybe she went for a long walk, Mel thought, got lost. Maybe she met someone else and shacked up with them. But what Mel really thought was that Joanna had been noticed, was now circling in the dark water like a mindless ballerina. The last thing Joanna saw as she looked up, Mel thought, would have been the moonlit outline of the boat above her. The last thing Joanna saw when she looked down, Mel wanted desperately not to consider. Now Mel's phone lit her face from below like a cold campfire. She thumb-typed Dresden Cockerel Lake into a search engine. She scrolled quickly through fairy tales and travel advice. She typed Germany, and without letting herself hesitate, spirits and water. Mel typed drowned and cockerel and Saxony and sack, and the phone glowed and pulled up an abstract from a history journal, and sitting on the cold ground, with her back to a London tree, Mel found the Poena Cali. This punishment she read in the dark. She mouthed the Latin of Justinian. She whispered glosses and translations. A novel penalty for a most odious crime. Parricide. She looked it up. This is not execution by the sword or by fire or any ordinary form of punishment, but the criminal is sewn up in a sack with a dog, a cock, a viper and an ape. Mel stopped. She put her hand to her mouth. Sewn up in a sack with a dog, a cock, a viper and an ape, and in this dismal prison is thrown into the sea or a river according to the nature of the locality, in order that even before death he may begin to be deprived of the enjoyment of the elements, the air being denied him while alive, and interment in the earth while dead. Poena Cali. Säcken, the punishment of the sack. The poena was first mentioned in antiquity as already antique, an arcane sadism. Mel made a sound. This punishment, she read, was last imposed in Germany in the 18th century. The punishment, she read, of a woman for infanticide in Saxony. Leather on the house floor, the thing straining to split. She read, the cockerel's dying call marks the place of sinking. Kikiriki, the rooster had said, paying her attention. Kikiriki, pay attention. This is where we are. And the waterlogged woman had spoken. Down she had gone in that last sack with cockerel and dog and snake, with her bites and rips and screaming, swaddled together as the leather went tight. Had it been a relief when the water came in, or the worst moment of all? Everybody wanted a body, but the lake would not deliver. When Mel first returned, when the police took her to the home, the emptiness bewildered her. She barely slept. Her dreams were no longer of Joanna slowly changing in the water. Now they were of a dark wood, of a doubled-over figure with uncertain limbs. She was staying in a small guest house near the lake. She continued urgent correspondence with scholars. She sought and found no local stories. No one could tell her anything about the executed woman, the woman who had hauled herself up again centuries after her death, noted Mel, reached for her, taken Joanna. What do you want? Mel asked her in her head. Revenge. She imagined answers from the sack, justice, company, my child, a retrial. None of those was what the woman had whispered for. Something's missing, Mel thought, and still did not know what it meant when she thought it. She drove to the lake. The local priest was waiting for her, as arranged. He was tall and thin in his 60s, leaning against his car like a much younger man. He was incongruous in his robes. Mel had paid for the service he was to perform. In her halting German, she thanked him enough to make him soften a little. The priest nodded and began to read aloud. He muttered in fast German. Mel tried to follow in English, reading the words she and the priest had written together. A sanctified apology for the abominable execution, a prayer for the convicted women, a plea to let her rest. Too late for Joanna, thought Mel. She cried silently over the lake. Is this enough, she thought. Will you stop? Mel put her hand to her mouth. A terrible gust. She couldn't breathe. The priest kept on with his recitation. The surface was disturbed, and the stench told Mel to fuck her priest and fuck his blessing. She almost fell. Stop! Mel shouted. She staggered off the jetty as fast as she could. Mel ran to her car. She shook. I need a lawyer, not a priest, her thoughts raised. To declare a mistrial or something. It was the law that stitched the woman up, that had dragged her with the animal, scratching, biting, screaming to the water. It was the law that listened to the cockerel beg its last living time and let the lake close over the Poena Kala. Mel drove away before the priest could reach her. She drove away from the lake and only pulled over after several minutes. With unsteady hands, she took out the printouts of all her articles. The dog means loyalty, maybe. The serpent, this may be a killer of its parents. The ape, uncanny. But in that water, all that would dissolve. Everything in the sack would mean itself. A thing that drowns and bites, that drowns and claws, that drowns and bites, that drowns and screams. Mel could still smell the lake as if it was on her skin and in her clothes. She leaned her head on her steering wheel. Behind her eyes she saw a dark, bent double figure. She sat up. She shook her head to clear it. She hunted through the papers again. Animals might be represented by images on paper or wood, she remembered. Men and women could be drowned with drawings. The woman, she read, the last woman, had been sacked with snake and cockerel and dog, and that was all. Those markings on the water-blackened medallion she'd found and thrown away. A thing not with 5 limbs, as Mel had first thought, but with 4, and a curled tail. A missing animal, an ape, a lack. The boat moved across the water. Mel rowed like an automaton. She breathed lightly, in terror that the stink would return. Somewhere beneath her, Joe circled, or swayed, her softening foot held by a root. It could be like this forever, Mel thought. This was not so bad, even with the hissing of her cargo. She could pull this rocking boat in the dark, in the moonlight. But Mel was soon in the centre of the lake, and there was nothing else she could do but what she was there to do. Mel had crawled through the garden of the lakeside house. As the light failed, she had crawled and groped through the undergrowth, feeling with her fingertips. She checked every piece of wood she touched, but there were so many, she never had a chance of finding what she'd thrown away. Something had gone missing. The wooden ape had worked out through rot, escaped the hankering sack, being washed to shore for Mel to throw away in the dark. The sack had stretched towards her, nothing trying to get out, trying to pull something in. The Poena did not want justice, it wanted completion. How the fuck do I get hold of a monkey? Mel had thought, in panic, and then remembered the law. Apes were rare and expensive, the law allowed. Cats may be used instead. Mel hefted the sack. It was heavy with the cat and a big stone. The cat yowled and screamed and got a paw out by the drawstring, and the boat pitched with all the jostling. Swells rose from below. Mel started to cry. She met the cat's terrified, furious eyes as she forced it back in. She tied the bag closed, claws shoved through the fabric. She held the bundle out. It might have been a warning stink she smelt then. It might have been that the water seemed excited. The boat shook as the hidden cat moaned and scrabbled. She looked down, and it was very dark. But even in the night, through the black water, she saw a darker thing, still rising. Mel screamed. The cat screamed. She let it go. With a plop like a pebble in a well, the lake swallowed the bag, and the cat's noise ended. Bubbles streamed up. The boat pitched in the quiet. Mel leaned over a tiny bit and looked down, strained to see the pale bag descending. But it was too dim, or it had fallen too fast, or it was enveloped in mud, or something had pulled it down because she saw nothing. Mel leaves work early. It is nearly spring and the pubs are full. Her new colleagues invite her for a drink. She smiles and hesitates and joins them, though she doesn't stay long. It gets better and worse and better again. Christmas was hard. She dreamt of the dark figure, the lost ape remnant on the wood. But the nightmare ebbed. She still has them sometimes, but they're only dreams. She'd fed the thing a sacrifice. Mel spends the days at a computer, pushing text around, templates. She is quiet, fearful of attention, but a real person, living in the city. The city is dark and pleasantly cold. Mel buys microwave rice at the shop on the corner. She reads email on her phone as she passes a church and a laundrette, and descends to her basement flat. She turns on all the lights and showers to music. Her radio is made for bathrooms, it sticks to tiles. She leaves it playing when she's done. Mel calls her father and talks to him, while she cooks over the muffled radio and cars and vans muttering past at head height outside. In the middle of the conversation, the music from the bathroom gets abruptly louder. There is a thud that makes her wince, then silence. The radio has slipped off the wall. It lies broken on the shower's floor. She bends to pick it up. Her face gets close to the drain. Her throat catches, and she steadies herself, her hand down in the cold wet. She smells old rot. Mel runs. For an instant the thought comes that there might be a blockage, a problem in the pipes, but she knows that smell, that decay and sluggish lake water. It is not a London smell. And Mel knows, as it fills her flat and she runs and tries to breathe, and the air grows freezing around her, that she has always known that she would smell it again. There is nowhere beyond some attentions. In the kitchen and the bathroom and the bedroom, in the hall, the lights go out one by one. Darkness comes in. "Why are you here?" she whispers in her head, while she sinks to her knees and the smell comes and the light goes. "What do you want?" There are lacks that won't be filled. Mel tries to make herself small. Something comes before her. It knows her. There is the clucking. Hiss. The execution sack streams. It gushes. It's so much bigger than it used to be. She fed it and it's bloated, a glutton. It has eaten more and taken time. The leather sack lurches wetly and protrudes with inside limbs, and over her whimpering, Mel hears a crack and animated sounds and words and the grind of bones. Here comes the Säcken, full of new things. She hears cat noises. Here comes the Puena Kulai, and it would never not come, and like the stomach it is, it will have her and everything. Its sutures unravel. They open not to let out, but to take in. The Säcken opens to feed, to make her Puena. And this time there is no Joanna to wake and save her. As the leather strains and the Puena looms and reaches, and a dog tries to speak and a long dead woman meows like a cat, and a snake makes words and the Puena opens and rank water pours out, Mel sees through the shadows what is inside at last, and screams and screams, and still hears a faint last sound. Kikiriki, she hears. Kikiriki, whispered in a voice she knows. Cheers. Don't have nightmares.